So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about some of the work I've done, because I think some of the work I've done could be of interest to you. I'm going to talk about some of the work that Kathy has done. She wasn't actually on the program, but she was going to come up for a few minutes and talk about her work in Cambodia and since then, because I also think that'll be of particular interest to you. And then talk about sort of why we did it, how we did it, and what I think that might be useful for you as you think about your career paths and your goals, your personal and professional goals. I am a lawyer. I went to law school here at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. I found, and this is true of a lot of graduate programs, I found that the people who went for higher education at graduate level, if they knew what they wanted out of it, they really enjoyed it, they worked harder, and they had better outcomes, both personally and professionally. At law school, a lot of people go into law saying they want to promote justice, they want to improve the world, but they find that the easiest path is to take a job with a private law firm. There's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of the people who did that ended up not being very happy, because that wasn't why they went to study in the first place. It just meant it was the path of least resistance to pay off their student debt, which we have a lot of in this country, and also to have a nice standard of living. So when you think about beyond your university years, if you want to go for higher education, a small sample survey of mine and Kathy's and our friends is that the people who do make their choice about what they're going to study very consciously and intentionally are much happier in their subsequent lives, professionally and personally. For me, I went to law school to do two things. One, I think the biggest human rights problem in the United States is poverty. It's something that's not discussed very often as a human rights problem. And before Donald Trump, we didn't have a lot of the kind of political problems and problems with democracy that we see in many other parts of the world. Those questions were pretty much solved. Free speech, free and fair elections, they were automatic in the United States. They're now under question. So that's a whole other subject we're not going to get into today. But poverty is something that has never been taken seriously in this country by governments, because we have this free market capitalist ideology, which suggests that it's up to everybody to make their own way in life economically. And that leaves a lot of people behind. It doesn't address the fact that people are different. Some people have strengths that work in a capitalistic society, and some people don't. So I went to law school to work on what I thought was the biggest human rights problem in America, and I started by working in something called legal aid, which is free legal services for poor people. So if you make less than, in this country, 125% of the average income, you're eligible for free legal services. So I started the Berkeley Community Law Center, which is just across San Francisco Bay in Berkeley. It's now called the East Bay Community Law Center. And most of my clients were homeless people. One of the things you probably know about the Bay Area is that it's famous for having a significant homeless population. It's not that much bigger than other parts of the United States or even other big cities in the world, but San Francisco is quite well known for it. And the government was not providing sufficient services for them. So I did that for 5 years. And then basically took a long vacation to travel in the world before we had kids. And I ended up in Cambodia, just by coincidence. How many Cambodians are here? Okay. So Cambodians know this, but the world's biggest peacekeeping mission ever by the United Nations was in Cambodia in the early 1990s, from 1991 to 1993, because Cambodia was like Israel Gaza is today. It's very hard for even a lot of younger Cambodians to know this. It was front page news all around the world because a guerrilla group called the Khmer Rouge were still in the jungle, and Vietnam had invaded and was occupying Cambodia. And all the great powers were focusing their attention on this very small country in Southeast Asia. I arrived with Kathy when the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission was leaving after they had their first elections. And I worked for the United Nations Human Rights Office there for 5 years. So the second goal I had when I went to law school was to work on international human rights. So I wanted to work on human rights in America on poverty, and I wanted to work on human rights internationally on things like civil rights and political rights. Things like free and fair elections, free media, freedom of speech, the right to legal counsel when you're arrested, torture, women's rights, children's rights. These are all things I worked with in the UN. What did I learn from that experience that would be useful to you? Well, I'm sure, I know Cambodia still has a very large United Nations and humanitarian presence, so a lot of the biggest NGOs in the world are working in Cambodia still to address all sorts of problems, both human rights and legal and social justice issues, but also business development, things like access to clean water, access to health, all the things that make up a good society. Liberia, the same. I know there's a lot of international aid going into Liberia. Guatemala, I don't know as much about. I've been to Guatemala and I've seen the aid community there. I don't know how big it is. But if you want to work in virtually any field from an international perspective, whether it's even economic development in the business world, or whether it's a social justice area or humanitarian area, there are very large numbers of UN agencies and international human rights and international humanitarian organizations that are looking for capable, committed people. So back to my point about graduate school, same here, professionally. If you really want to do this kind of work and you want to have an impact, they're looking for people like you. These organizations actually, this is my possibly unfair critique, is that the senior management in most of these organizations are people who've lost their passion and actually have very high salaries and don't deliver very well. The people who make these organizations function and succeed on the ground are younger people who come in with ideology, idealism, passion, commitment, work really hard, and make their bosses look good and deliver services that are valuable to people. I think this is a very exciting way to work. It also will give you the opportunity, probably, if you work for a UN agency or an international organization, to not only work in your country, but to go and work for those organizations somewhere else in the world at some point in your life. And then you can bring back what you've learned outside of your country to try to help the people the citizens of your country. I'll just tell you a little bit about what Kathy did in Cambodia. Kathy, when we arrived in Cambodia, Cambodia had been in civil war for 23 years, from 1970, after a coup d'etat, until the UN held elections in 1993. And one of the reasons I'm so well known in Cambodia is because Hun Sen and the CPP, this is for you Cambodians, stole the election in 1993. They lost, but refused to leave power. And I've been very outspoken about that and subsequent elections that were not free and fair, where there was a lot of violence. And I know in Liberia and Guatemala, you've had similar problems. There have been a lot of very contested elections, very poorly run elections, stolen elections. And one of the things that Cambodians, I know, but I also know because of Guatemala right now, because there's a huge amount of controversy about corruption in Guatemala, that corruption is one of the things that upsets people the most. So I worked a lot on those kind of issues. What we also saw when we arrived in Cambodia was that there was a very significant problem of violence against women that had never, ever been addressed by patriarchal societies. So in the history of Cambodia, despite the fact that it was common knowledge that husbands often beat their wives for trivial things like not having dinner ready on time, and this was known in the community, and if you go into any village, they would know which men were beating their wives and which women were being beaten. There had been no attempt at a governmental level or socially to try to address this. So Kathy, obtaining funding through the Asia Foundation, which some of you may know, did the very first study of violence against women, not just in Cambodia, it turns out. It turns out there had never been one in any developing country at that point. Her report was called Plates in a Basket Will Rattle. And I wish I could translate it back into Khmer, but it's basically saying that if there's a disturbance in the kitchen, like the shaking, the plates, the glass plates that will be in a basket where you store them will make a noise, they'll rattle, and then that rattle will go away. And that's how Cambodian women talked about being victims of domestic violence They'd be beaten, make a little noise, but, well, it's not a big deal, and it would just go away. And they had to suffer it. So Kathy did that, and then Kathy, because this was her passion, went to graduate school after that, got her PhD at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is at the University of London, and she's been there now for 20 years as a professor. When we left Cambodia after 5 years, I was recruited to become the Asia director at Human Rights Watch, as Barbara mentioned. There are two very large global human rights NGOs, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And we work on all rights. We work on civil rights, political rights, economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. Everything from the right to health, to the right to housing, to free and fair elections, to free media. I don't know how many of you have ever thought about possibly working in human rights? Oh, that's great. How many of you think of human rights primarily as things to do with politics and media and elections and torture and things like that? Okay. So what I wanted to also leave you with today is that anything you work on can have a human rights dimension. What's often not understood about human rights is that basic economic rights, the right to a roof over your head, housing, a right to clean water, a right to heat in your home in the winter or cooling in the hot season. All of these things are human rights. They're all in the international human rights documents. Almost all governments around the world have signed up to all of these things, and yet most governments don't pay much attention to them. So even if you are deciding to work in an NGO that works on health, that's a human right. It's not just the health sector. If you are a nurse or a doctor, that's a human right. If you are a teacher, the right to education is embedded in international law. That is a right. So why is it important to think of it as rights? Because you can make demands on all sorts of institutions, governments, international aid donors. All three of your countries receive substantial amounts of international development assistance. How is that money spent? Is it spent on senior civil servants getting nice jobs and going to expensive lunches, or maybe taking trips overseas, which happens with a lot of international assistance, or is it actually getting into the classroom and helping children learn and having better outcomes? Those are rights issues. So whatever you do, and Barbara, you wanted me to emphasize this, you can be working for a big company, but you can still have a social justice lens on what you're doing. You can still try to work from whatever your position is to make the world a better place, not just to get a better outcome for your company or your project, or to have a better profit margin for the company. So human rights is all encompassing. It's everything. There's almost nothing we could talk about that wouldn't or couldn't have a human rights dimension if you are conscious about it. Not all of you need to think of yourselves as human rights champions. That's not necessary for the world to be a better place. If we had people with better ethics in companies, particularly big multinational companies, who thought about the consequences of their decision making, they could become human rights champions, even though no one would think of a CEO of a big chemical company, for example, as doing human rights work. But they can do it by having good policies inside the company about how they treat employees. They can have good, for example, maternity benefits. So make sure that women, when they're pregnant and have children, get the right time off and the right health care. They can have proper whistleblowing policies so that when something's going wrong inside the company, it can be reported up the chain and that appropriate action can be taken. These are all in their own way, whether you call them human rights issues or social justice or just good governance, very important things to make a society function better. And so whatever you're doing, you can, if you're conscious about it, push your institution or the people you work with to be better human beings and have better outcomes for the world. So, what does a human rights worker do on a day-to-day basis? I'll just share a little bit about that. Human rights work is largely about fact-finding, so uncovering what is happening, because you can't really demand anything from a government or an institution unless you know what the facts are. So it's a lot of investigations. It's a bit like being a journalist, like an investigative journalist. You have to do this completely impartially. In other words, you can't start thinking, I'm going to prove this bad thing happened, because you then have bias in your work. So you have to have an open mind from the beginning. You may have heard there's a problem. Let's say you heard, to give you an example of a project we worked on recently, we heard in northeastern Cambodia that they were building dams on the Mekong River, this huge river in Cambodia, to create hydroelectric power. And we heard that they were not following the law and international best practices to consult with local residents before they did it, and to pay them proper compensation for the land when they took it, to clear it to build the dam. So we went up there and we interviewed about 70 people. And we were able to establish that there was a pattern of taking the land, out consulting, promising people that they would be compensated with other land. Turns out that other land is very far away, not close to any roads, not close to any markets, there are no schools. So yeah, they may have gotten the same amount of land, but it's a completely different way of living. People who were surviving mostly by fishing in the Mekong were moved to areas where there were no rivers, so they couldn't actually get basically free food by fishing. They had to now buy their food at markets that were far away, which meant they had to have jobs that produced cash, whereas in the past they were fishing, eating the fish, and selling the rest to pay for other costs. So we did that. You do that kind of research, and then you try to make judgments about whether or not you see a pattern, and that it's fair to claim that this is a systemic problem. And then you try to identify who's responsible. And here we had a patchwork of government that made false promises, both at the national level and local level. We had these very big Chinese and Vietnamese companies that were running the dam, that were building it, who'd also made promises, made commitments at a global level to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And then we had lots of local business people who were just trying to make money out of this kind of project. And then what do? You publish your findings, you take it to the media, and this is why I'm well known in Cambodia, because Cambodia has something called Radio Free Asia, Khmer Service, Voice of America, Khmer Service, and I've been interviewed on those stations for the last 25 years and basically saying what we're finding. And that makes the government very unhappy, to the point that the Prime Minister held a press conference a few years ago, Hun Sen, specifically to ban me, to announce that he was banning me from being able to go back to Cambodia. So I can no longer go back to Cambodia, which is very disappointing for me, because I have so many friends there and I miss being able to go there. This is standard human rights work. The thing I didn't mention is a lot of the people who complained were being targeted by local officials, so being threatened and intimidated so that they would shut up and stop complaining. So this is civil rights, which is the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of association. These are economic rights, which is that imagine waking up one day and being told to get off your land, you lose your house, move from here to move someplace you've never been, and you have no choice. That's a pretty basic set of rights. And attached to that is going to be your access to education, your access to health. In this particular case I'm talking about, access to clean water became difficult. They were able to dig wells where they lived originally, but much harder to find fresh water where they moved. So your whole life is upended. Now, I just described the easy part. The hard part is having some results. because when you do human rights work, you're up against very powerful interests, whether it's a government or companies. They've made decisions to do what they've done, and it's not easy to get them to change their decisions. So you spend, and this is what I think the most interesting part of the work, or some of the most interesting part of it, is you spend a lot of time strategizing about how do we put pressure on the bad actors to change their behavior. I mean, has anyone experienced anything like I've just described in any way, shape, or form in your communities, in your personal lives? So in a few minutes, I'm going to stop and ask for some questions, but I would love to hear your own experiences and how you experience that, and what you think you can do as a person or as part of a community to address that. I did also just want to also talk a bit more about Kathy's work. So Kathy, after doing this work on violence against women in Cambodia, got her PhD on human trafficking, which was the next thing that she was interested in, and then got hired as a professor. And her passion has basically always been about women's rights. So violence against women, trafficking has largely been gender-based phenomenon. Not only, there are plenty of particularly young men who are trafficked for work like in the construction fields. Like the whole World Cup tournament in Qatar was based on young males being brought in, particularly from South Asia, to build these huge stadiums for the rest of the world to admire. But underneath all those stadiums were a lot of dead people from Nepal, Bangladesh, India, who died in the heat or died on unsafe construction sites. But for the most part, trafficking has been taking advantage of women. Kathy has, and this is just, I'm bringing this up just to give you ideas about how your life can take different turns. She started with working on violence against women, domestic violence, family violence, and she started working on more on violence against women more broadly in the communities, because that doesn't only happen at home. And then she started working on trafficking. Trafficking is always about moving people from one place to another. So she started working on labor migration. Trafficking is part of a labor migration problem. By working on labor migration, she's now started working on refugees and asylum seekers, because that's also part of migration. All these areas opened up to her because she had this kind of one idea of working to protect women from violence and unsafe conditions generally in life. Okay, the last few things I'm going to say before we open up for discussion and questions is I'm sure all of you have, it's funny I'm saying this term, core values. Is this yours or is theirs? This is theirs. Core values, mission and vision. Very appropriate for this discussion. So your core values, I mean, I think you probably just heard this. I didn't hear much what was being said. Your core values are absolutely essential to who you are and what you will be. We all know this. It's easy to lose sight of your core values as you make the journey through your education and professional life, particularly when you start to work for bigger institutions that make demands on you. So whatever your core values are, and I'm assuming that they're all great if you're in this program. I don't think you would have been chosen if you didn't have a strong set of core values. Refresh them. Think about them. Be conscious about them as you go through your education and professional life. Big institutions, particularly companies, but not only, if you work for the UN, I can tell you at the UN, there were a lot of pressures, for example, for us to just shut up and stop criticizing the government. Because my part of the UN, which was the human rights part of it, was very critical. The United Nations Development Program, which is working very closely with the government to do big infrastructure problems, thought that we were making their lives much more difficult. So they literally came to our office and said, please stop criticizing the government. To which we said, well, we might as well go home, because the situation is very obvious. We're just actually stating the obvious in a lot of cases in Cambodia. And I think you will know that in Liberia and Guatemala too, right? There's plenty of things at the governmental level that need attention. You don't have to be a genius to identify what they are and say what they are. So whether it's the UN or a company or even NGOs, there can be pressures to make you move off your core values. And just try as you make your journey through your professional lives to be conscious of what they are. And then you have to make decisions. Sometimes, even, I'm a very outspoken person. Sometimes I didn't say exactly what I wanted to say at a time because I thought it was in the best interest of achieving the goals of protection of human rights to sometimes find a different strategy than always just being confrontational and loud. And sometimes I was getting good advice about doing things different, but always thinking about it against what our mission was, what my core values were, what the core values were of the organization I was working for. Okay, is it a good time to stop?
Yeah, I want to start the questions. Is that okay? Will you explain to everyone a little bit about CRI and your work now?
Oh, sure. Okay. Sorry, that was a big error. So I started this thing called the Berkeley Community Law Center because I saw a gap. And while I was at Human Rights Watch, I saw that, I see still that climate change is largely being talked about as a problem for the environment and a problem for polar bears in the Arctic and a problem for small species, but is not being discussed very much as a problem for human beings, which to me is just insane. Because we're like, right now, do you know the story of, the metaphor of the frog that's in the pot and they start boiling the water and the frog just, because it gets warmer slowly and the frog never jumps out. But if you throw the frog in a boiling pot, it'll jump right out. I think we're the frogs in the pot right now. This is happening around us, and it's happening to the weakest, poorest, most vulnerable people in the world first. And because, I'm sure a lot of you have come from very difficult backgrounds economically. I don't know. That's what I understand, at least some of you. But every one of you is privileged compared to most people in the world. Just because you're here right now and you're in the education system you're in right now, whatever background you've had, you're still now privileged. I'm very privileged. I'm a white male American. That's about as privileged as you can get. There are hundreds of millions, and we don't have good numbers, maybe 1 billion people suffering direct consequences of climate change right now that are having a material impact on their lives, on their health and well-being right now. And that's going to get worse. And so we need to change the discussion and change the narrative so that the discussion is about human beings, the consequences of climate change for human beings. Because if we don't do that, we're going to still be that frog in the pot that just doesn't really realize what's happening to us. And so I started this organization because I see there's a gap. Human Rights Watch is a fantastic organization, but they weren't moving to address this problem quickly enough. Other big human rights organizations aren't because, frankly, they have a lot of other problems to deal with, right? The world's a really messed up place right now. So it's hard for them to say, oh, we're going to drop working on democracy or on the war in Gaza or the war in Ukraine or the war in Sudan or you name it. So I started this organization. We just got going in May. We just published our first report, which was about deforestation in indigenous community in Mexico by the avocado industry. Who likes guacamole or avocados? Yeah, you're not all Californians yet. If it was just a California crowd, every hand would have gone up. But they are driving people off their land. They're stealing their water. They're cutting down their trees. They're basically ruining the area where they live so that we here in richer countries who buy most of their avocados can have guacamole or avocado salads. So that's what I'm doing now. It's an NGO. We're only 10 people right now. And I'm going to Indonesia next week to release a report on how the nickel industry, which is being mined for electric vehicles, is ruining indigenous areas in Indonesia, places where there had been no industry, sometimes no roads. And our view as Westerners is that that's a very primitive way of living. Actually, people in those communities were very happy. They had what they needed. They had enough clean water, food, that they didn't want what we have, but we are going in to try to address the problems that we've created in the global north, and ruining where they live so that we can have electric vehicles instead of gasoline-powered vehicles, to decrease the consequences of climate change. So we need electric vehicles, but we shouldn't do it by destroying the other communities, particularly since we caused the problem here in the rich world, and to go into the developing world in the global south and ruin communities is just pretty unconscionable. So there's a million other things I could tell you about climate change, but I'm happy to answer any questions. But that's what I'm doing now.
Okay, I have one more question before I let everyone else have a question. I loved what you were saying about Kathy, and you said that she's working in human trafficking. A little bit more about what she's doing. Like, is she doing research? Is she starting an NGO?
Yeah, so if you are interested in doing some of the kind of work we discussed, you can do it as an academic. So Kathy is an academic. She works at a university. They tend to get large grants from governments and foundations, and they do often single country, but more often multi-country studies of a particular problem. So Kathy's big interest right now is what interventions will work to protect migrant workers. She's working on a lot of things, but so there's been a lot of study of migrant workers. And you might say, like, even the stuff I told you earlier, probably have heard stories about similar things like this. Like, it didn't sound brand new to you. My guess is that these kind of problems happen around the world and you've heard of them. And the real reason we all do this work is not to expose the problem, but to try to find a solution. And so in academia, often you can bring really big teams to try to address a problem. And Kathy's feeling is like, we've done enough studying of them. We need to now have interventions. We need to figure out what will work to try to address these problems. So she's pioneering work globally on interventions to protect migrant workers. And maybe sound like a small issue, migrant workers. Well, actually, there are hundreds of millions, probably over 1 billion migrant workers in the world right now. Out of 8 billion people, there's probably at least 1 billion migrant workers. Because capitalism sucks people towards where there's money and pushes them away from where there isn't. So people are on the move all over the world. In China alone, there's more than 200 million migrant workers, just in China. Because to build China's industrial capacity, they're bringing people in from Western China to Eastern China, where all the factories are. Cambodia, I know that. There's a lot of migrant workers. I don't know about Guatemala and Liberia, but it's a big and growing problem. So here's a shout out for a really, I think, fulfilling career staying in academia, if that's your interest. You write the big academic papers, they get published in journals, but it also, if you are inclined, and Kathy is, you can also work with policymakers and have influence about how policy is made, including about how money is spent. So Kathy's, I've had the privilege of testifying at the US Senate or British Parliament or the Parliament of Thailand, Indonesia, plenty of places. Kathy the same. As an academic, she's been brought into the House of Commons in Britain. The State Department brings her in all the time to speak to them about how they should go about doing their programs, et cetera. And in many other countries, I'm just mentioning the US and UK, but many other countries where she's worked. So that's a super exciting and interesting and fulfilling life, if that's of interest to you.
So interesting. I kind of knew, but I didn't really understand, both of you. So thank you. Does anyone have questions for Brad? Why don't you...
Hi, I'm Sope. I'm currently a senior. I study psychology and anthropology. I do a lot of developmental psych, so I worked a lot with children. And I did an internship back at home with Aiden Bridge Asia, worked with children who are victims of sexual assault. Very frustrating coming out of that internship with the Cambodian legal systems. And I just want to hear more about your experience, like what have the Human Rights Watch done to ensure that the policy that they're advocating for are being enforced correctly? I think that's a big issue in Cambodia. Also, the second part is, how is your experience different from my colleague, and what was being done to ensure that they are being safe doing all this work compared to you as a foreigner?
Those are great questions. So on the first, on human trafficking, most of the work is being done through UN agencies and bilateral donors. The government would not, some governments can take criticism, and so I can criticize the Indonesian government, for example, and then still meet with them, which is what I'm going to do next week when I go to Jakarta. The Cambodian government, they will not talk to critics at all. So we were not able to engage directly with the Cambodian government. We used to. I mean, in the 2000s we did, but in the last decade, no. So most of the work is being done through UN agencies and like USAID and other donors. The question is, like, how results oriented are they, and how much do they just want to be there and participate? And I think they have a very mixed record in Cambodia of wanting to just maintain good relationships with the government as opposed to like really challenging the government and pushing them. We know the Cambodian government has these kind of very high profile raids on trafficking, but we also know that that's partially fake. Like even if the raid is real, to show the world that they're serious, they'll take some high profile action, they'll bring journalists, they'll bring cameras, but that's like 1% of the problem. And they know where the other 99% is, but they don't do anything. So that's the challenge we have right now. So much corruption in trafficking. Your question about, and this is a really important question, I told you I was privileged, and I am very aware of that. I have been banned from multiple countries, not just Cambodia. And one country, a couple countries have put out arrest warrants for me, but they were never going to really do anything to me. It would be a front page news. I'm not that important, but I'm the kind of person that if they did it to, it would be front page news globally. Which is why you don't read about it, because it's a big decision to physically harm somebody like me. All I can say, because I don't know the situation in every country, in Cambodia, it is very dangerous to be a very outspoken human rights activist. A number of them have been killed. To be an outspoken journalist is very dangerous. That said, there are still many people, many of my Cambodian friends who've been working there for decades, and yeah, they've gotten some minor threats, sometimes more serious, but they've been able to do their work. So you can generally find a way. The people who've been harmed have been extremely confrontational. There are still ways to work in this field, and I think do it safely, but it requires a lot of thought, and it requires working for an institution that cares about your safety. That's very important.
Awesome. Kim Hee.
So you mentioned a bit about like the result of the Human Rights Watch. I just want to understand, how do you measure the success of what you're doing? Is it like to bring awareness, or do you see like its effectiveness in like countries that you've been writing about?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. And that was a really good question, and one I hate. Because it's very hard to measure impact when it comes to human rights. We get that from a lot of the people who give money to support the work. By the way, human rights work is all funded by private individuals or foundations, not governments, not companies. At least Human Rights Watch didn't take money from, so we don't want anyone to think we have a conflict of interest. But we get that question, so it's a great question, and so I'll give two answers. One is, think about this like a sports analogy. We're playing defense a lot of the time. We're trying to stop bad things from happening. And one thing that we're really sure of is if we all disappeared and stopped doing our work, the world would be much less safe and much more dangerous. There'd be many more human rights violations. That I think we can pretty easily show. But what we want to do is go on offense. We want to make the world a much better place. We want to address problems, not just prevent them, but we want to address them and find systematic solutions. And on that, sometimes we have direct victories. We'll campaign for a new labor law, for example, or a new environmental law, or a new law protecting the press, or laws, like in Cambodia, there's so many laws. I wrote a number of laws that are now Cambodian laws when I was working for the UN, working with government agencies and with members of parliament. Then the question is the law implemented? And of course, that's a challenge in most countries, not just Cambodia and lots of other countries. And and then the question that, if you're honest with yourself, is, let's say you wrote the law, I wrote these laws, can I take credit for it? A little bit, but there are a lot of other people involved in getting that law passed. And then if it's implemented well, there's going to be a lot of other people who we don't even know. So to the point about, can you do, good human rights work almost no matter what you do, if you're a police chief and you implement a law that protects the rights of people when they're arrested, and you implement it properly and safeguard their rights, you're doing human rights work. You can do it at all sorts of levels. And do I get the credit for writing the law, or does the police chief or the police officer get credit for not beating the person, which was standard in Cambodia on an arrest 30 years ago? You would be beaten. And it's less common now. So there've been significant improvements. So it's very hard to actually know what your contribution is to improvements. But I think we're very conscious that it's part of a bigger picture and that we made an impact. And the last thing I'll say is, another test we have is, how much does the government hate us? And why would they hate us if we weren't having an impact, right? Why would they care? So we're obviously, in a lot of cases where they're really outspoken against me or my organization or other organizations, we're stopping them from doing something they want to do. And so that's a form of impact.
I'd love to have a question from one of our Guatemalan scholars, because I know there's a lot of human rights issues in Guatemala. Have you any Guatemalans? Great, Janet.
Hi, thank you for coming today. Yeah. And my name is Janet. That's the name that I was given. I'm from Guatemala, and I was curious about it. But first of all, I'm thankful for the work you're doing for the world, and then I was thinking that all what you said, nickel mining, that's something that is also occurring in Guatemala. And when people tried to stop it, the community, the government sent soldiers and shoot at all of them. And I mean, this is something that is happening in our countries, and or trafficking, or all of these issues. And I was wondering, after so many years working in this to solve these issues, and seeing these patterns that continue to occur in different countries, what would you say are the main causes, and what would you say are the best solutions for us to address them?
Thank you for the very simple question. First, where are you from in Guatemala?
From the highlands. I'm from Quiché, which is my country is Chicasanango. It is a Mayan Quiché town in the highlands of Guatemala.
Hmm.
Oh, and by the way, Guatemala is 42,000 miles square miles.
Yeah, not very big.
Not literally, yeah.
But yeah, I've been to Guatemala. That's why I asked. Actually, one of the first major human rights problem I ever saw was in Guatemala as a tourist in 1987. That was what?
That was not a good year.
Not a good year. There was a massacre at Lake Atitlan, and we didn't know about it, but we showed up like the day after, and there were all these military, and it was really horrible. So yeah, that was my first exposure as individually to major human rights violations. What are the drivers of human rights problems? Well, I mean, I can use just basic words: power, greed. These are human behaviors that we've seen documented from the time that history has first been written in virtually every society. I think we'd all like to imagine there were these paradises where this wasn't an issue, but if you just look at the patriarchy in most parts of the world, I mean, that's a form of power that's been used from day one, as far as we can tell, in most societies. There are some non-patriarchal societies, but they're very few, so that's a form of power. Have people lived in harmony over sharing resources? In the past, it seems the anthropological evidence is yes, better. But in the modern world that is based on capitalism, China still is run by the Communist Party, but there's almost nothing more capitalistic than the Chinese Communist Party. There's no more communist ideology in the way they do economics. It's just a way of holding on to power. So that's what we're up against. And what we can see in the current world we live in is that a lot of that on the greed side has been consolidated into multinational companies that now are often more powerful than individual governments. And if you just look at how afraid the most powerful country in the world is of some companies, i.e. the United States, you can imagine what it's like to run a smaller country when a company comes in and says, do what we want, and we will invest in your country and create tens of thousands of jobs and boost your GDP, but it means that we're going to cut down whole forests, we're going to pollute your rivers and streams, and we're going to pay very poor wages to a lot of people so that we can make a profit. By the way, we'll also give you a little money on the side. So that's a lot of what we're up against. And that kind of desire for money and power is what activists around the world are confronting. And by the way, I should have said earlier, again, it's really kind of easy for me at Human Rights Watch or people at Amnesty International or international NGOs to do our work compared to the people who are really heroic, are people confronting this on the ground on a daily basis with no money, no allies, no legal standing, literally facing guns, getting threats on their phones all the time, having people visit their houses saying you should stop this or something bad's going to happen to you. That's the really important heroic work. And the people who are doing this are up against really powerful interests. The solution is the opposite of what I've just said. The solution is holding companies and governments accountable for their actions, creating legal and policy environments that require them to behave differently. In climate change, for example, I believe that we're heading that direction just too slowly because all of us are in that pot. We're all frogs right now. It's getting hotter around us. We're all going to suffer. It is very hard for anyone to think that they're not going to be affected by climate change. So maybe Elon Musk doesn't care because these things, people like that, the mega wealthy think they're so wealthy they can stand on the top of the highest mountain and not be affected by climate change as the oceans rise. But there aren't very many people we all realize it now. So we'll probably, in climate change, we'll probably end up making progress. It's one of the reasons I want to work on this. I feel like it's possible to make progress, and it's urgent that we do. But some of the other things, we had 7 coups d'etats in Africa this year across the Sahel. 7. And the African Union has said no more, and they would expel any government that had a coup d'etat. It's 7. And there's similar sort of power grabs around the world that just aren't called coups d'etats. They're power grabs by elites who make it impossible to have free and fair elections. Cambodia is a perfect example of that. So I'm not going to. It's a seminar to answer your question. There's no easy answer except we have to keep fighting.
That was excellent. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Moon, why don't you go?
Hello, Brad. I have a question. So I've been to Malta to study, and most of my courses I take there is international law regarding to human rights. And one of my professor mentioned that international human rights is not abandoning, it means the government have the right to choose kind of some of the policy that are recommended to them that fit into the country. So that's why most of the action is not taken seriously according to that. And so that at the end of the semester, I wrote a paper suggesting that the world should have international, like strict international law that can just, take really action to bring down those people who don't really, follow the law. Because right now we don't even have that. We just have kind of like to put pressure on some country that don't really meet the quota, whatever that they promised at, at the summit. And then the second question I have is just like, what would you advise to young people who like interested in working in the same area that you're working right now, and how can they, step in right now without, avoiding any dangerous whatsoever? We use Cambodia as an example.
Thank you. Can I just start by asking someone from Liberia, does your court system work? Does someone have an answer to that? Like, does it work? Does it hold people accountable? If do most people in the country have faith in the court system? No. No. And President Johnson was not able to make a big impact on that? She tried, right? And she was up against very powerful interests, yeah. Because I didn't really know much. I don't know much about Liberia. I'm sorry. I know Guatemala has had real problems with the court system. They've had some very high-ranking prosecutors and judges who have been fired. There've been killings, and they just recently kicked this kind of external investigative system out because it was getting too close to the truth. In Cambodia, the same. I mean, I think the courts are probably, they're completely controlled by the government. They do whatever the government says. They have very low standing in opinion polls. People don't believe in the courts, and they shouldn't, because you get justice there if you buy it. You don't get it there because of the merits of the case. So that's the partial answer to your question. Any rules-based system will have to have a court system that functions. If you don't have functioning courts, you can't possibly have justice. And one of the interesting things is that whenever dictatorial people either seize power or try to maintain power, the one institution they want to control the most is the court system. That's the first thing that they take control of, even before the treasury or if they lose control of the court system, they actually then can be prosecuted themselves and lose power. So they immediately install loyalists in the court system. In Cambodia, my country I know here, the Minister of Justice has always been someone who would simply salute the Prime Minister and do whatever the Prime Minister says. And that's how they make sure they're never investigated for corruption or all the other things that you're talking about. So to fully answer your question, we're looking for a world where there's accountability and justice, that no matter who you are, what level of society, you're held accountable. And the more democratic countries do a better job at that. I don't know if there's any country that does a perfect job at that. But on a scale of 1 to 10, there's some that are 8s and 9s, and then there's some that are like 0s, 1s, and 2s. I know Cambodia is a 0 or a 1. Sorry. I don't know. Where would you put Liberia? Is it a 4? That's pretty good. In Guatemala?
That's what happens after a few decades of wars.
Yeah, and listen, I don't want to decontextual. Let me just make one other point. I really think is important. At least for Cambodia, Cambodia's current situation is because of what this country did. Yeah. And we can't forget that. The United States war in Vietnam then moved into Cambodia, and until then, Cambodia was not at war, and there was no genocide, and this country still hasn't paid compensation. So it's easy for us to like just say, oh, Cambodia is terrible or some other country's terrible without looking at ourselves. And in terms of resource extraction, the United States has been leading the world in that. Now, Dan, last point, because we're going to run out of time, is how can students or young people get involved? I don't know what opportunities you all right now have for internships. Take advantage of them. I get CVs for jobs all the time, and the thing that can separate one candidate from another, who are, you get all these amazing young people applying for jobs, is to see what you've done and what level of commitment you have. Because as an employer, you don't want to hire someone who you think is then just going to work for you for a little while and then go do something else. You want to get a sense of that there's a strong commitment. So you can say that in your cover letter, and that's also important to write a very strong cover letter. I'm sure you guys have all talked about this and learned about cover letters and resumes. But what you have done is the biggest indicator for whether you are the right person for a particular job. So definitely take advantage of internships. Apply for fellowships. A lot of universities now have fellowships, like for the first year after you graduate. I have somebody working for me right now who has one of those. And also when you go to, if and when you go to graduate school, you should apply for everything you can to bolster your resume. My own experience is that your GPA is not even asked about by most employers. So I'm not saying don't study hard. Study hard. Make the most out of your education. Really, yeah, I mean, do. I say that to my own children. I have 2 children in university right now. But don't think like a 3.8 versus a 3.7 is more important than a 3.7 plus a really interesting experience as doing an internship or something else. That will be more important to an employer and get the door open for you to get you the interview and have the conversation. Anyway, one last thing I'll say is in the human rights field, go to where the problems are. If you want to do human rights work in your country or somewhere else, it's very hard to go in through the front door of a big institution like the United Nations or Human Rights Watch. But if you go where the problem is and do good work on the ground, it will be seen and recognized. Remember I said earlier that a lot of the top people at the UN and other organizations aren't very capable. They kind of sit around and take their salaries. It's the people on the ground who do the really good work and make them look good and actually have impact. If you do that work, that is a meritocracy in my experience. There's a lot of places in the world that aren't really meritocracies, but doing good work on the ground in the humanitarian or development or human rights world gets recognized.
I have a question. What do you mean by that? Like, go to where those dams are being built in Cambodia and get a job? Is that what you mean? Like, go to the area where everything is?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily where the dam is being built, but if you want a career in human rights, sitting in the capital city and working for an organization that where you don't sweat or get your hands dirty is probably not, it's not going to be easy to get the job, and B, it's not going to be particularly valuable. So yeah, you go do community organizing in some area where there's a problem. You do academic research in that area. Publish your reports, but don't publish your report and then have it sit in cyberspace somewhere where no one sees it. Take that report and do something active with it. Get it in the hands of the media, get it in the hands of decision makers. Go knock on doors with your findings. Yeah, I mean that's and then I know I know everybody's committed to going back to their own country, but at some point in your lives, you may decide you want to also try something else somewhere and go to the place where there's stuff going on. Like if you want to be a human rights worker, go to South Sudan. Go to Bangladesh and work with the Rohingya community. There's so many places now where you can do it. Go and get that experience. That will also make you much better later if you end up getting promoted to be a senior person in an organization. If you actually understand what's going on in these kinds of situations, you can make better decisions when you're leading an organization about which policies and practices you should adopt.
That's really good advice. Wow. Thank you, Brad. That was really impactful. Did you guys like that? I thought it's a good way to end the summit, don't you think? Yes.